This review copy was provided by Nintendo. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is the black sheep of the series. It's not confined or constricted by a lot of the rules of the series, and for those very reasons, it became one of the more well-known classics over the years. Now with this 2019 remake, it doesn't try to rebuild it, but rather fixes a lot of the limitations of the Game Boy while adding on the new coat of paint. I'll do my best to avoid spoilers here because despite this being over 20 years old now, some people still will be playing the story for the first time. On a cold and stormy night, Link finds himself battling the howls of the storm until he succumbs to its powerful winds. Moments later, he wakes up on an island where he meets Marin, a girl fascinated by the life outside of her island. Upon getting to know his surroundings, Link comes across an owl that tells him in order to return to his home, he'll need to wake up the windfish with the instruments hidden away on the island. With this objective in mind, Link sets out on a mission to find these instruments and return home. While it isn't the most grounded story for the series, it does introduce a lot more freedom to the setting, its characters, and so on. It's apparent throughout each corner of the world you begin to explore and unravel the mysteries of the island. For veteran explorers, you'll find the story to be an exact one-to-one replica of the 1993 original, even including some aspects of the DX release too. While you won't find any story surprises here if you've played the original, it's still no doubt one of the best entries in the Zelda series simply for the story. This 2019 remake sets out to not rebuild or remake a classic, but to fix a lot of the limitations set forth by the platform it was on back in the 90s. Suddenly with the Nintendo Switch, you're not just limited to 2 buttons on the Game Boy. You can actively have multiple weapons equipped without having to drop an item to make room for another. The camera shop that was present on the Game Boy is gone. After all, you don't have a Game Boy printer for the Switch. Instead, it's now a dungeon maker, though because it's limited to only using the floor panels of dungeons you've already explored, it's not as lavish as something like Mario Maker, and sadly you can only share your creations using Amiibo. There's also been some quality of life changes like being able to open up your menu and recall previous conversations, helping you remember where you last left off or a clue towards your next objective. Outside of these notable changes, Link's Awakening is still the same old classic adventure that it was before, just with a new look. The game opens up with Link waking up on the island after a storm destroys his boat. Now stuck on this island, he has to retrieve the hidden sacred instruments to get himself home. Gameplay is structured like most top-down Legend of Zelda games, following the grid system that was started by the original. However, with this remake, that grid system has become interconnected, cutting out any transitions with a straight-up all-integrated world. It's beautiful, like diving into a large open world. It's from there that you're essentially left to your own wits to figure things out. This is a game that pushes you to explore, figure out what to do, and use context clues to solve puzzles. Yes, there are some resources like the Owl Guide or the call centers where you can get tips towards your next objective. However, inside the actual dungeons, you're mostly left to your own devices to figure out how you're supposed to get inside the objective room. I really enjoyed that style of no hand-holding gameplay that was more popular in older games. It's vaguely familiar to the opening of Breath of the Wild. Dungeons in this title focus more on finding keys rather than forcing you to use all of your items to get through dungeon. In that sense, I think it can come off as a bit more simple than later Legend of Zelda game dungeons, but that didn't keep them from being challenging. Across the 8 dungeons, and yes, the optional 9th dungeon from DX is here too, all feature some sort of specific puzzle trope that kept things feeling fresh. Furthermore, outside of the dungeons, the now connected world further enticed me to explore it for secrets and items hidden away in every corner of the map. Ultimately, Link's Awakening feels very much like the same game it was back in '93, but with some quality of life improvements that make it more approachable for modern times. If you're a veteran seeking out new content, then this won't really offer that. What it will offer is a walk through memory lane with newfound imagery that makes you fall in love with it all over again. I think a lot of us were wary of Link's Awakening getting a remake simply because beyond its gameplay, it's one of the most charming looking classics on the Game Boy. Despite the limitations of the Game Boy's visuals, Link's Awakening looked beautiful then, and it's still just as delightful as ever. The new coat of paint transforms Link's Awakening to this adorable little diorama piece that looks like a cross between Captain Toad and the new Animal Crossing. While there was a certain appeal to the 2D sprite art, I'd say that this remake feels more like what a lot of us imagined the Game Boy original to look like. That was part of the fun of playing games with visual limitations. We had the simple preface for what things were, but our imagination filled in the gaps of what they truly detailedly looked like. Now those gaps are being filled by the game artists themselves, and the results are breathtaking. It looks like I'm overlooking a 3D clay model project of a university student. The soft rounded edges of characters look absolutely adorable, and it's only better sold by the facial expressions that Link makes. The way he sweats when he struggles to lift something or he blushes when he gets a kiss makes me chuckle every time. One drawback of this new coat of paint though is that once again we've hit the limitations of the platform. Whether it's the now fully loaded interconnected world, the cinematic depth of field effect around the game at all times, or some other visual key, Link's Awakening does struggle to run at times. In dock mode, the dynamic resolution ranges from 720p to 1080p, with the resolution dropping in the more open outside areas. In portable mode, that resolution is around 570p to 720p, with somewhere in the middle being the average. Both modes target 60 frames per second, and while it does hit more often than not, there are a few instances of frame rate dips. Since this game doesn't use the usual buffer system, that means that rather than dropping a few frames, the game rounds it down to 30 frames per second anytime there's a significant drop. This is to maintain frame pacing and avoid screen tearing, but in practice, it's incredibly jarring. This area in the swamp, for example, feels terrible in comparison to the rest of the game. It's really weird to see this out of a first-party Nintendo game, that's for sure. When it comes to music, The Legend of Zelda has never been a slouch in that department. Minako Hamano and Kozo Ishikawa's music continues to be the blood of this game's musical veins. Recreated with a simply outstanding orchestra arrangement with the occasional sprinkling of chiptunes, this remake's music is a marvelous feat. Accompanying the stellar work of art is the brilliant sound design put in place for the smallest of actions. I love Link's little voice that matches the cuter look of this remake. He's higher pitched than something like Breath of the Wild, and just hearing his little "hya" puts a smile on my face every time. I can hear a cartoonish spring whenever I jump, the difference in terrains as I waddle over them, and the sound of grass being brushed as I walk through it. All these elements help build an immersive representation of a childhood story I grew up playing. Much like my sentiments with the visuals, it truly does paint a picture of what I thought this game both looked and sounded like in the 90s. My one slight disappointment with the sound was the lack of any HD rumble use. I can't recall off the top of my head any major use of the feature when I was playing the game, and it would have been a nice addition for a charge slasher of fighting an enemy. Perhaps it's because the Switch Lite came out the same day and that doesn't have any HD rumble, but regardless, it's a feature I missed. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is a classic, and this remake continues to show why it's gone down in history as one of the best games in the series. If you grew up playing the original, you'll find this remake to maintain the excellence of the past while smoothing out the limitations of the Game Boy. Sadly, on the way there, you do hit some of the limitations of the Switch as well, but get past it, and you'll have the definitive edition of Link's Awakening. It makes me incredibly excited for the future of the platform and to hopefully see some other classics get the same treatment.